Hello and welcome. This is Dr. Victor. This video is part of the series I created for the course that I'm teaching titled Object-Oriented Design in Java. In this second video, I'm going to talk about how to read from and to write to a file with a Java program using Gson, and how to fix the issue where the Gson library does not support the class we are working with. Let's begin. When we start writing more useful programs, we will want them to be able to read and write files. This allows our data to persist even when the program terminates, and in other cases, to be used by another program. Java provides a lot of ways to read and write data. However, some ways require the same program, or at least another program written in Java, to make the process seamless. An example is reading and writing serialized Java objects. One way to mitigate this limitation is to write files in a format that is standardized and readable by other programs, in Java as well as in other languages. One such format is the JavaScript Open Object Notation, also known as Gson. JSON is a file format where data are being written as plain text and as attribute-value pairs. For example, if you want to store a person's name, the JSON file would have an attribute called firstName paired with the person's first name as its value, and another attribute called lastName paired with the person's last name as another value of this attribute. And all of these are written in a standard way in plain text. To make our Java program capable in reading and writing in JSON, we need a library to do that. Here, we use the Gson library created by Google to do so. To start, we start another empty Java project in IntelliJ, and I've created one called Useful Program with Gson. Next, we are going to get the definition of the Gson library from Google. To do that, we go to File on the top left, we choose Project Structure, and we are going to choose on the left panel, Libraries, under the project settings. You can see that now it's empty, but we're going to populate it. So there's a little Add button at the top called New Project Library. We choose that, and we're going to choose From Maven. This brings us to the dialog box of downloading the library from the Maven repository. So over here, we're going to type com.google, google.code, code.gson, gson. We might want to click the little magnifying glass icon on the right-hand side or press Shift-Enter so that this little tool is going to look up all of the versions of the Gson library. So as you can see, we have a couple of them. We're going to choose the latest version, 2.9.0. And then we're going to click the download to the library so that it downloads the jar file, and it's going to help us to just make things a little bit easier. Once we have that, we're going to click OK, and then you can see that now on this screen of the project structure, we see one library being added. We're going to click Apply, and we're going to click OK. Right. So if you want to verify, you can go to the project structure on the left navigation bar, and then you can see that now we have underneath the liblib folder, we have a few extra files, including the Gson 2.9.0.jar. Okay, so next we are going to define a class representing something simple. Let's create a class representing a person, and for simplicity, we are going to have just one member field called name. So we go to Source, and then right-click, choose New, and Java class, call it Person, and then press Enter, and then we are in the definition of the source code of the person.java file. So inside, we are going to have just one field. So we have private, we have the type string, and let's call it name. Next, we're going to create a few methods that allows us to actually create a person object and also to be able to access this name member field. So we press Alt, Insert, we choose Constructor, and then we're going to choose that one member field, and then it's going to generate a parameterized constructor. Next, we're going to do the same thing. We press Alt Insert. We choose Getter and Setter, and it's going to let us create a pair of methods that is both, one is getting the name, the other one is setting the name of the object or person. Okay, so next we are going to create another Java class. We're going to call it main application. Main application. And it is going to serve as the entry point of our program. So as you have expected, we are going to create a very specific method called main, and it has to be of a certain type. So it is going to be public static void main. And then we're going to do the rest a little bit later. But let's just talk about what is our plan. So we want to create a main application that is going to do one of the two things. One, we want to try to read from a JSON file that contains some data, if this file exists, and prints its content. Otherwise, if the file doesn't exist, we are trying to create a list and then store its content into the JSON file. So if that's the case, next time we run the program, this file will exist and we can read the content from there and print to the screen. Here in this example, we are going to store all of our data in an ArrayList when the program runs. So to do so, before we go into the definition of the main method, we are going to create one private, and we're going to make it static so that we don't have to instantiate an object of the main application. And we are going to store everything in ArrayList. So we're going to use the type ArrayList. And we're also going to tell Java that, you know what, this ArrayList is going to be specifically store person. So I'm going to choose person. Let's give it a name, say the list. Right. So right now it's just a reference because later on we are going to create such an instance of an ArrayList and let the list to reference to it. Here, IntelliJ is going to say, well, what is ArrayList? So we're going to press Alt Enter to import the definition of ArrayList. All right, so the next thing we want to do is we go into the main method and we are going to start working on the code. The first thing we want to do over here is we want to create a file handler. So what we are going to do is we're going to call an object, create an object called file, and let's call it the file. We're going to instantiate it with the constructor, and at the same time we are going to tell it, okay, well, this file is going to refer from now on to a particular file. So let's assume that this file storing our data is going to be called persons.json. So by convention, if we are creating a JSON file, we are going to use the extension Gson. You can use anything you want, but convention helps us to understand what or expect what's in the file. Again, IntelliJ is going to say, so what do you mean by file? So we're going to press Alt Enter to include the definition of the file object, so it knows what to do. Now, the next thing is we are going to decide whether we want to read from a file or we want to create something and save into a file. So to do so, we are going to create an if statement. So if the file exists, so if the file, we call a method called exist. If it exists, then we try to read from the file and then we print things onto the console. So I'm just going to add a comment, say read from the file, print content. Now, if this is not the case, so we go into else block, and then we are going to create a list or an array list, save to a file, or write to the file. All right, so let's start with reading from the file. So here we are going to use a very interesting, what we call a try-catch block. Without going into too much details, it's basically a mechanism in Java that allows us to handle errors if it happens. So I'm going to type try, and I am going to do something over here. So inside, the first thing I want to do is if I'm going to read from a file, I need to create an object that allows us to actually read things from a file. So a class that does that is called FileReader. And let's call it FileReader with lowercase f in the beginning. And we are going to pass as a parameter to its constructor so that it knows which file we are talking about. So in this case, this is the file. The next thing we want to do is we need to create a description of the array list so that later on when the Gson object that we use to read from a file, it knows how it will look like. So we need to have a special class called type, and we are going to create the definition that is going to be defining how an array list with persons as its items will look like. So we type type, and then we are going to give an object a name, so lowercase t, and then we are going to create such a type object. So we use type, and we can also now press Alt Enter to say that, okay, well, you're going to use the definition under java.lang.reflect, and then we are going to create a new type. So we're going to create a new type, type, token, token, and then we're going to say it is going to be an array list, and then it is going to be storing person objects. Then we're gonna generate such a thing by calling a method called getType. Okay, so again, we need to include this into our project as a library reference. So we're gonna press Alt Enter over here. All right. Now, the next thing, now we have kind of like a definition of how that data is going to look like in the file. We're going to tell Gson to do that, to do the reading for us. So we first create a Gson object. So lowercase g, Gson, new Gson. And the next thing we want to do is we are going to include this library. Press Alt Enter. And then we are going to call a special method called from.json, so that this Gson object is going to read from a file, and then it is in the format JSON. So we're going to read it, and it's going to return the list, which is the type that we expect. So we say the list equal to Gson dot from JSON, and then we're going to tell this object or this method, okay, well, you're going to read from the file reader, and you are going to expect a type called type, which we say it is going to be of the type ArrayList person. Now, assuming that we have read the list correctly, then of course we want to print it out, right? So to do that, we can just use a very simple enhanced for loop. So for person, let's use p, and then we're going to say from the list. And then inside, we are going to just print the name. So we s out. And then we just use the getName method. So p.getName. Now, once we are done with printing, we don't really actually need the file. And when we think about it, the moment that we finish reading from the file, we don't really need to access the file anymore, right? So to help us do that, to release the resource or the file so that other programs can access it, we are going to call the close method of the file reader. So before we use the for loop, we don't really need the file anymore. We can call file reader.close, and then it's going to release the resource. Now you will see that IntelliJ is going to have a little bit of like red lines underneath file reader as well as close. The reason why is that these are the methods or constructor that might cause a problem. So if we take a look at what IntelliJ suggests us, one of the suggestions is to add a catch clause. So we're going to click this little guy, and you'll see that now at the bottom of our try block, there are two catch block of code showing up. Essentially what that means is that when an error occurs, it is going to jump right into this line, 929, and then it's going to do something. The default action is quite simple. It's just like throw another exception and do nothing else. For in this demo, we are going to replace this with simply just printing an error message out onto the console screen. So we can use the variation of sout, which is SERR, stand for standard out error or system out error. And then we are going to say, well, if we hit this point, there's something wrong with the file reader, right? Error in creating a file reader object. So this is one of them. Now you can see that there's another catch block. So this catch block actually can handle the case where the close method is called. Sometimes it just cannot close. So we're going to just do the same thing. Replace the default action with standard error. And then we are going to say, well, there's an error in closing the file. Right. So that's pretty much it. That's what we expect if the file exists. So it's going to read from the file. It's going to print the content out. If something goes wrong, say it. So looks good on this end. The next case we are looking at is what if we don't have the file? The file does not exist. So we're going to create our own list. So in this case, we are going to say the list, and then it's going to contain an instance of an empty list. So we create an array list, and it's going to start with there's nothing in it. Then we're going to add a few items in it. So let's add 3. So we're going to add the list using the .add method, and we are going to create a new person here. So use new person. Let's create a new person with the name Bruce. So we have Bruce. We'll do the same thing, the list, and then .add. Create another person, new person, and then this time let's call our person Clark. Cool. Let's add one more. We have the list, we have add, we have new person, and let's call this new person Barry. Right. So 3 persons added to our array list. That's great. Now the next thing is we want to save it into a file. Right. So here we're going to do something very similar to what we did earlier over here when we are reading a file. So here we're going to use the same technique. We use the try block. And then inside we are going to create an object that allows us to write things. So I'm going to use file writer inside reader. And then let's just call it file writer, lowercase f in the front. And we're going to create a file writer. We're going to tell file writer, you know what, you're going to write to this file handle. Right. Again, file writer is not defined yet. So we are going to, there's no catch clause yet. We are going to do that in a moment. The next thing we want to do is we are going to do the same thing. Now Gson, we're going to use the Gson object to save things into a file. So we're going to use Gson, create another object called Gson. And it's called Gson. The next thing is we're going to call a method that actually allows us to save whatever from the file, or from the program to a file in the JSON format. So we are going to call the member method of Gson called toJSON, and then we're going to tell it to write the list into the file, and also it is going to write to the file through the file writer. So the file writer. All right. Next, again, now we are done with writing the file. There's no point to keeping the file, so we're gonna close it. You see that now there are 2 red lines underneath file writer and close. Similar reason, because they might produce an error or an exception. We can choose the add catch clause action here, suggested by IntelliJ. It's going to generate a catch block for us, and we're going to replace this default action with an error message onto the console. So system.error.println, say error in writing the file. All right. So that is pretty much it. There we have a entry point that either will read from a file if it exists, and then we are going to, otherwise you're gonna create such a list, save it into a file. So let's give it a run. So we come to the top, we click build and build project. And then IntelliJ is going to put everything together, including getting the definition of Gson that we downloaded earlier, and we are going to run the application or the program. So we go to run at the top, and then we choose run main application. So you see that nothing really happens. The reason why this is the first time we run this program, the file doesn't exist. So we kind of expect that it's going to do the writing. Now, another thing you can see is that on the left navigation window, you will see that there's a new file generated called persons.json. Right? So let's take a look at what's inside. You can see that now we have a square bracket, and inside the square bracket, we have 3 individual curly bracket sets. Now, this is what I was referring to as the attribute and value pair. So we have the attribute called name, and the value is Bruce. For another entry, it is going to have the same attribute called name, but this time the value is Clark. Same for Barry. Right? So this is a plain text JSON file. So let's say we run this program again. So this time this file does exist. So we will expect it to actually go to this block. The file exists. So let's give a run, go back up to run main application. All right, so you can see that now the output actually produces something. It produces the content of that 3 objects or items. It contains the name Bruce, as we expect. It's printing the name, and the second one is going to be Clark, and the third one is going to be Barry. If you want to run it again, it will produce the same result because now the persons.json file exists in the project. So every time and we start the program, it's going to say, well, the file exists. I'm going to print the content out, and this is the same result that you're going to see over here. All right. The last thing I want to show you here is what if we want to make this program a little more useful, so that for the person, we want to store more than just the name of the person. So we first remove this JSON file, so we start from a new, and we are going to add one more attribute or member field into our person class definition. We're gonna add private, and we are gonna use a class called LocalDate. So it stores a birthday. So we're gonna add birthday to our class. Okay, so the LocalDate, and we are going to add something more in our constructor. So we're gonna say, okay, well, pass me a LocalDate. Let's call it birthday again, and I'm going to store this as my member field. So birthday here. Same thing. Here we're gonna create a few more member fields over. Member methods, the getters and setters. So alt insert getter and setter corresponds to LocalDate, and that's pretty much what we expect in our person. Now, the next thing we want to do is we're going to go back to our main applications, and we're going to modify a few things. The first thing we notice is that there's some red lines here. Now, the reason why is that when we are trying to add a person, now we don't have a constructor that only takes in one parameter as a string, as a name. We need to add a few more over here. What we're going to do is we need to input a birthday of the type LocalDate. So let's do that. What we're going to do is we are going to use the auth static method from LocalDate to create such an object. So we're going to use LocalDate.auth, and then we are going to put in the year, the month, and then the day of the month. So over here, let's give Bruce a birthday. So let's say Bruce was born in 1972, and in February, and it's going to be on the 19th. Same thing goes with Clark. For Clark, let's create another birthday, and his birthday is going to be of the year 1980, and on the month February, let's say, and it's going to be on 29th. Right. Lastly, for Barry, create another one, LocalDate, and then we are going to give Barry a birthday of 1992 in September. It's going to be on September 30th. Right. So it's going to create a few person objects. Now it has one more field called birthday. So we'll expect that, when we print the content out, it's going to be not just this one, but let's just say also print out the birthday. So say was born on, and then we're gonna just print out the date or the birth date. So we're gonna access it through the get birthday member field that we created, and this is roughly what we need to do over here. So we set up the class of the person representing the person. We set up the main method. Let's give it a build and see what happens. Now, when we run the program, you will see that there's something that is wrong over here. You see that there's some error saying that, not accessible, and it generates a little bit of suggestion like change visibility or write a custom type adapter over here. Now, why is it the case? The reason why is that for the Gson library, it sometimes doesn't really know how a particular class or item class is being read or written. In this case, it can do simple stuff like for the strings, it's fine. But then there's something that, say, the local date, it doesn't recognize. So the next step we need to do, if such a case occurs, is we need to teach Gson how to actually read and write a particular class object. So in this case, it's going to be the local date. So we have to do this for both reading and writing. So let's start with the reading part. So over here, assume the file exists. So we're going to replace our line 20 that creates a generic Gson object into something that actually teaches it how to create or how to read and write a local date object. So we go to here, line 20, we're going to replace this with new. We're going to use the GsonBuilder that builds a custom Gson object. And here we are going to use a method called register type adapter, or the third over here, register type adapter. So inside, what we need to do is we need to tell, okay, well, now if you see such a class, do the following. So in this case, we're going to teach Gson, we're going to recognize local date, which is a class. And then we're going to teach it, okay, if you see a class, this is how you write, and this is how you read. So we use new, we use type adapter. And then we are going to say this type adapter is for local date. So inside, we are going to define or override whatever write or read is supposed to be. So we are going to use the tag override, and then we are going to say, okay, well, you know what? You are going to do the following in order to properly write things. Use public, use void, use write, and then I'm going to say, okay, well, Gson writer, which is the tool that Gson is going to use to write things. And let's call it Gson writer. And that's going to write something of the type local date. Let's call it local date. And it might throw some exceptions as we expect. In this case, we don't really want to care too much about it. Do it this way. And then inside, we are going to say, you know what? If it happens that you want to write a local date, you are simply just going to convert the local date object into a string. So we can use the toString over here, and that's it. And we fix those red things. Say we import the class, Alt-Enter for Gson writer, and it knows what it is. The next thing is we also want to teach Gson how to read things. So we do the same thing. We use the override tag, and then we use public, and then it is, since it is reading things from a file, it needs to return a local date object. So we're going to use the return type local date, and we call it read, and then it's going to be Gson reader, and let's call it lowercase Gson reader. Again, it might throw an exception or cause some issues, so we're going to just simply type throws exception. In this case, it's IO exception. And we are going to define how this method is going to read things. So it turns out that a local date has a way to look for a string in a certain format and then convert it back into a local date object. We're going to make use of that. So it's going to return local date.parse. This is the method. and it's going to get the string that is read by the JSON reader. So JSON reader.next string is going to read the string, and then the pass method is going to pass it or convert it back into LocalDate, and then allowing the Gson object to be able to read things. Last but not least, we need to create such a thing. So we use create over here. Okay, so that is basically how we want to rebuild or create our custom GsonBuilder. Now we want to do the same thing for our the writing block. So we're gonna simply copy this guy, go down to our line 53. We place our generic creation of generic new Gson with this definition over here. Right? So the rest are the same, because all we are doing is we are teaching or creating a specific Gson object that knows how to read or write the LocalDate class objects. All right, so with that, let's give it another try. Let's go to our build, and let's try to run it again. So you can see that there's an error. The reason why is that last time we tried to run, it did try to create a file called persons.json, but if you can take a look at that, there's nothing there, because Gson just doesn't know how to handle an object with a LocalDate class in it. So what we want to do is we want to remove this file so that we start from the beginning or from scratch, so that it's going to start with creating a proper list. So we're gonna again build and then go to run, and then you can see that now there's no error, nothing going on. It means that we probably have successfully do this. You can see that now persons.json appears again. If we click on that, you can see that now there's content in it. On top of our name Bruce, now we have the birthday attribute with a string, which is the year, month, day of month format. Right, so let's run this program again. This time this file exists, and we are going to print the content out. Okay, so let's run the program again, and as we would have expected, we print more than just the name, but now was spawned on a particular date. So there you have it, a Java program that uses the Gson library to read and write JSON files. And we also talk about how to teach the library to handle classes that it does not recognize. I hope you learned something useful, and if you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and share it with your friends. I hope to see you soon again. Bye.